Cheers and welcome to this week's Halloween-inspired Badgernory. I'll be reading Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. I hope you're sitting comfortably with your warm milk and snacks, because this one is a real doozy. Chapter 1. The Horror in Clay. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all of its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas and infinity, and it is not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining its own direction, have hitherto harmed us a little, but some day the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality, and of our frightful knowledge will open up position we're in, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into peace and safety of a new dark age. Philosophists have guessed its awesome grandeur of the cosmic cycle wherein our world and human race form transient ascendants. They've hinted at a strange survival in terms of which would freeze the blood if not masked by bland optimism, but it's not from them that there came a single glimpse of forbidden eons which chills me when I think of it and maddens me when I dream of it. That glimpse, like all dread glimpses of truth, flashes out from an incidental piecing together of separate things, in this case an old newspaper item and notes of a dead professor. I hope no one else will accomplish this piecing out. Certainly, if I live, I shall never knowingly supply a link in so hideous a chain. I think that the professor too intended to keep silent regarding the part he knew, and that he would have destroyed his notes had not sudden death seized him. My knowledge of the thing began in the winter of 1926 to 27, with the death of my great uncle George Gamble Angell, Professor Emeritus of Semitic Languages in Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. Professor Angell was widely known as an authority on an ancient inscriptions, and had frequently been resorted to by the heads of prominent museums, though that his passing at the age of 92 may be recalled by many. Locally, interest was intensified by the obscurity of the cause of death. Professor had been stricken whilst returning to Newport boat, falling suddenly, as witness said, after having been jostled by a nautical-looking, inappropriate word, black person, who had come from one of the queer dark courts of the precipitous hillside, which formed a shortcut from the waterfront to the deceased home in William Street. Physicians were unable to find any visible disorder, but concluded, after perplexed debate, that some obscure lesion of the heart, induced by a brisk ascent of so steep a hill by so elderly man, was responsible for the end. At the time I saw no reason to dissent from this dictum, but latterly I am inclined to wonder, and more than wonder. As my great uncle's heir and executor, for he died a childless widower, I was expected to go over his papers with some thoroughness, and for that purpose moved the entire set of files and boxes to my quarters in Boston. Much of the material which I have correlated will be later published by the American Archaeological Society, but there was one box which I found exceedingly puzzling, and which I felt much averse from showing to other eyes. It had been locked, and I did not find the key till it occurred to me to examine the personal ring which the professor carried always in his pocket. There indeed succeeded in opening it but when I did, I so seemed only to be confronted by a greater and more closely locked barrier. For what could be the meaning of a queer clay bas relief, disjointed ramblings and cuttings which I found? I had my uncle, in his later years, become incredulous and most superficial imposers. I resolved to search the eccentric sculptor responsible for this apparent disturbance and an old man's peace of mind. The bas-relief was rough rectangle, less than an inch thick, about 5 by 6 inches in area, obviously modern origin. Its designs, however, were far from modern in atmosphere and suggestion, for although the vagaries of cubism and futurism and many a wild, they do not often reproduce that cryptic regularity which lurks in prehistoric writing, and writing of some kind and bulk of these designs seems certain to be, although my memory, despite much familiarity with the papers and collections of my uncle, failed in any way to identify the particular species or even hint at its remotest affiliations. Above these apparent hieroglyphs was a figure of evidently pictorial intent, though its impressionistic execution forbade a very clear idea of its nature. It seemed to be a sort of monster, or symbol representing a monster, of a form which only a diseased fancy could conceive. That's modern for nutter. If I say that I am somewhat extravagant imagination yielded simultaneously pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, I shall not unfaithful be the spirit of a thing. A pulpy tentacled head surmount a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings, but it was general outline of the whole made it most shockingly frightful. Behind the figure was a vague suggestion of a cyclopean and artificial background. The writing accompanied this oddity was, aside from a stack of press cuttings in Professor Engel's most recent hand, made no pretension of the literary style. What seemed to be the main document was headed Cthulhu Cult, in characters painstakingly printed to avoid erroneous reading of the word unheard of. This manuscript was divided into 2 sections, the first of which was headed 1925, A Dream and Dream Work of H. A. Wilcott, 7th Thomas, St. Providence, R.I., and the second, Narrative of Inspector John R. Legrassi, 121 Benville Street, New Orleans, LA, at 1908 AAS MTG. Notes on the same and Professor Webb's acts. The only manuscript papers were all brief notes, some of them accounts for queer dreams, that was old fashioned for strange by the way, of different persons, some of them citations from theosophical books and magazines, notably W. Scott Elliott's Atlantis and the Lost Mineral. The rest comments on long surviving secret societies and hidden cults, with references to passages in such mythological and anthological sourcebooks as Fraser's Golden Bough and Miss Murray's Witch Cult in Western Europe. Cuttings largely alluded to outre mental illness and outbreaks of gross group folly or mania in the spring of 1925. The first half of this principal manuscript told a very peculiar tale. It appears on March the 1st, 1925. A thin, dark young man of neurotic and excited aspect had called upon Professor Engel bearing a singular clay bas-relief, which was exceedingly damp and fresh. His card bore the name of Henry Anthony Wilcott, and my uncle recognised him as the youngest son of an excellent family slightly known to him. He had latterly been studying sculpture in Rhode Island School of Design and living alone at Fleur de Lis building near the institution. Wilcox was a precious use of known genius, but great eccentricity, and from the childhood excited attention through the strange stories and odd dreams that he was in habit relating. He was called himself psychically hypersensitive, but the strayed folk of the ancient city dismissed him as merely strange, never mingling much with his kind. He had much dropped gradually from social visibility, and was now known only to a small group of antithesists from other towns. Even the Province Art Club, anxious to preserve its conservationism, was found quite hopeless. On the occasion of the visit ran the professor's manuscript. The sculptor abruptly asked for the benefit of his host's archaeological knowledge in identifying the hieroglyphs in this bas-relief. He spoke in a dreamy, stilted manner, which suggested pose and alienated sympathy, and for my uncle shown some shapeness in replying, for the conspicuous freshness of the tablet implied kinship with anything but archaeology. Young Wilcox's rejoinder, which impressed my uncle enough to make him recall and record its verbatim, was fantastically poetic cast, for it typified the whole conversation, and which I have since found highly characteristic of him. It is new indeed, for I made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams that are older than brooding Tyre, or the complicated Sphinx, or garden girdled Babylon. It was then that he believed the rambling tale which suddenly played upon sleeping memory and won fevered interest of my uncle. There had been a slight earthquake tremor the night before, and most considerably felt in New England for some years, and Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected. Upon retiring, he had an unprecedented dream of great cyclopean cities of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with lantern horror. Hieroglyphics had covered the walls and pillars, and for some undetermined point below had come a voice, not a voice, a chaotic sensation which only fancy could transmute into sound, but which attempted to render the most unpronounceable jumble of letters, Cthulhu Fatang. The verbal jumble of the key of recollection which excited and disturbed Professor Engel, the questioned sculptor and scientific minuteness, and studied the almost frantic intensity as bas-relief of which the youth had found himself working. Chilled and clad only in his night clothes, when waking had stolen bewilderment over him. My uncle blamed his old age, Wilcox afterwards said, for this slowness in recognising both hieroglyphics and pictorial design. Many of his questions seemed highly out of place to his visitor, especially those which tried to connect the latter with strange cults or societies, and Wilcox could not understand the repented promises of silence which had offered exchange for admission membership in some widespread mystical or paganly religious body. When Professor Engel became convinced that the sculptor indeed ignorant of the cult or system of cryptic law, he besieged his visitor, and with demands of future reports of dreams. His bore regular fruit, for after his first interview the manuscript records daily calls of the young man, during which he related staringly fragments of nocturnal imagery, whose burden was always some terrible cyclopean visits of dark and dripping stone with subterranean voice, or intelligent shouting monotonously in idiotical sense, impacts unscribblable save as gibberish. The two sounds most frequently repeated were rendered by the letters Cthulhu and Rael. On March the 23rd, the manuscript continued, Wilcox failed to appear, and inquiries at his quarters revealed that he had been stricken with obscure sort of fever and taken to home of his family on Watermark Street. He had cried out into the night, arousing several artists in the building, and had manifested since then only to alternate the unconsciousness of delirium. My uncle at once telephoned the family, and from time forward kept close watch on the case, calling often at the Thayard Street office of Dr. Toby, whom he learnt it to be in charge. The youth's febrile mind apparently was dwelling on strange things, and the doctor shrugged now and then and spoke of them. They included not only a repetition of what he had formerly dreamed, but touched wildly on gigantic things miles high, which walked or lumbered about. He had no time to fully describe this object, but occasionally frantic words, as repeated by Dr. Toby, convinced the professor that it must be identical with the nameless monstrosity he had sought to depict in his dream sculpture. Reference to this object, the doctor added, was invariably a prelude to the young man's subsidence into lethargy. His temperature, oddly enough, was not greatly above normal, but the whole condition was otherwise such to suggest true fever rather than a mental disorder. On April the 2nd, about 3 p.m, every trace of Wilcox's malady suddenly ceased. He sat upright into bed, astonished to find himself at home, completely ignorant of what had happened in a dream, or relatively since the night of March the 22nd. Pronounced well by his physician, he returned to his quarters in 3 days. But to the Professor Engel he was no longer further assistance. All traces of strange dreaming had vanished with his recovery, and my uncle kept no record of his night thoughts after a week of pointless, irrelevant accounts of thoroughly usual visions. Here the first part of the manuscript ended, but reference to a certain of scattered notes gave me such material for thought. So much, in fact, that only ingrained scepticism, then forming my philosophy, can account for my continued distrust of the artist. The notes in question were those descriptive of the dreams of various persons, covering the same period as that which young Wilcox had had in his strange visitations. Pardon me. Oh dear. My uncle, it seems, had quickly instituted a prolonged, far-flung body of inquiries amongst nearly all the friends whom he had questioned with impertinence, asking for nightly reports of their dreams and the dates of any notable visions of some time past. The reception of this request seems to have been varied, but he must, at very least, have received more responses than the ordinary man could have handled without a secretary. The original correspondence was not preserved, but his notes formed a thorough and really significant digest. Average people in society and business, New England's traditional salt of the earth, gave an almost completely negative result. Although scattered cases of uneasy but formerly nocturnal impressions appear here and there, always between March the 23rd and April the 2nd, the period of young Wilcox's delirium, scientific men were little more affected, although 4 cases of vague description suggest fugitive glimpses of strange landscapes. In one case there is mention of a dread of something abnormal. It is from the artists and poets that the pertinent answers came, and I know that panic would have broken loose had they been able to compare notes. As it was, back in their original letters, a half-suspected compiler of having asked questions, I had edited a correspondence in collaboration of what he had latently resolved to say. This is why I continue to feel that Wilcox, although somehow cognizant of the old data in which my uncle had possessed, he was now imposing the veteran scientist. These responses from a Cesiust could barely tell a disturbing tale. From February the 28th to the 2nd of April, large proportion of them had dreamed very bizarre things, intensively of dreams being unmeasurable and the stronger duration, the period of the sculptor's delirium. Over a fourth of these reported anything, reporting sayings and half sounds not unlike which Wilcox had described. And some of the dreamers confessed acute fear of gigantic nameless thing, visible towards the last. One case, which notes described the emphasis, was very sad. The subject, widely known architect with leanings towards theosophy and occultism, went violently insane on the date of young Wilcox's seizure, and expired several months later, after incessant screaming to be saved from the escaped denizen of hell. Had my uncle referred to these cases of names instead of merely by number, I should have attempted the collaboration and personal investigation, but as it was, I succeeded in tracing down only a few. All of these, however, bore out notes in full. I have often wondered if the objects of the professor's questioning felt as puzzled as I did this fraction. It is well no explanation shall ever reach them. The press cuttings I have enumerated touched only a case of panic, mania and eccentricity. During a given period, Professor Angle must have employed a cutting bureau, for the number of extracts was tremendous, and the sources scattered throughout the globe. Here was a nocturnal suicide in London, where a lone sleeper had leapt from the window after a shocking cry. Here, likewise, a rambling letter to an editor of the paper in South Africa, where a frantic delusional deduces a dire future from visions he had seen. A dispatch from California describes the third officer's colony as donning white robes en masse for some glorious fulfilment which never arrives, whilst items from India speak guardedly of serious native unrest towards the end of March. Voodoo orgies multiply in Haiti, and Africa outposts report ominous mutterings. American officers in the Philippines from certain tribes bothersome about this time, and New York policemen are mobbed by hysterical Bavarians on nights of March 22nd to 23rd. The west of Ireland too is full of wild rumour, and legendary and fantastic painter named Ardas Bonnet hangs a blasphemous dream landscape in Paris Spring Salon 1926. And so numerous are the recorded troubles in insane asylums that only a miracle can have stopped the medical fraternity from noting strange parallelisms and drawing mystified conclusions. A weird bunch of cuttings, all told, and I can at this date scarcely envision the callous rationalism which has set them aside, but I was then convinced the young Wilcox had known the older matters mentioned by the Professor. Jesus Christ. Okay, chapter 2 next week of Call of Cthulhu from the commemorative edition of the Necronomicon, the best weird tales of H.P. Lovecraft. So that's chapter 2 next week, ladies and gentlemen, Badgerteers of all ages. I will be delivering that on the Badgernory part of my channel, and I hope you enjoyed me muffling a few complicated words and scratching out a few dodgy ones, and I will see you next week for more videos, of course. Well, I'll probably post another few videos tonight, and I will complete the Badgernory episode of Call of Cthulhu next week, if not part 3, etc, etc, until I finish it, because Jesus Christ, that was hard to read, but it's an excellent story, and I recommend you read it yourself, or get an audio tape, or watch the independent movie on YouTube, I believe. Right, I'll see you soon, and look after yourselves. Happy Halloween. Ta-ra.